Okay, so good afternoon. My name is Kershan Pancham Kalinath, and I'm going to be talking to you tonight, or this afternoon, about ways of knowing BRICS, masquerades, and other things. What are these other things? So let me just tell you a little bit about where we're going first. I'm going to give you a talk that's a bit of an experimental style that I've done talks before, and so I'm going to do a bit of talking, but I'm going to do a bit of reading as well, a bit of mixing in these ways of knowing to destabilize this TED genre of performance and this kind of grand song and dance thing. So I want to destabilize something and I want to unsettle something, and hopefully there's a shift somewhere happening. Hopefully there's a gap where you're not exactly sure what I'm talking about. Maybe I'm not sure what I'm talking about, but but hopefully there's a gap, because when there's a gap, that means, hey, there's something to learn. There's something there. There's a journey thing happening. So thank you to Safia. It really wouldn't be without Safia, all of this, and the TEDx team, but especially Safia with her critical insight and ability to read social justice and injustice. I think it's remarkable. So thanks, Safia, and thanks all of you for making the time to come and hold the space and do some knowledge stuff. So I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story about stories. It's not a new story. It's a way of telling a told story. It's a story about the blindness of seeing, especially when we see things only one way, when that way we see it is flawed. It's a myth. It's untrue. This blindness of seeing. For too long, we've seen the world uh, with its continents, by its land masses, and it's deterritorialized by now. It's jumped over land. It really is interconnected beyond land. And for too long, we've seen ourselves by race in South Africa. So I'm going to be talking about that. We've defined personhood by race, and we make ourselves races who deal with personhood instead of persons who deal and grapple with race. Who owns the situation? Is it the race that owns it, or are we people who own race and can control that history? So now the myths masquerade as truth. Somewhere we've forgotten that the map, the continents, the nations, east, west, north, south, like race, are conceptual categories, and they were not always so. At some point, this masquerade became a reality. And so this story is what I'm going to be talking about. It's a story that's been told before brilliantly by people like Arundhati Roy, Subhashini Mudli, Joseph Campbell, Julia Cameron, Robert McKee, and by ancient knowledges and shamans. And it's been told before, so I'm going to give you a different telling. So let's start small. Let's go small. Let's go to actually the world. Let's go for a story of the world. Right. I'm talking about BRICS, this Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa bloc, this economic bloc that's an emerging power that's going to be, kind of the question, are they going to reconfigure the world? They're going to be, how dominant are they going to be? They're going to reshuffle the world. So we want to tell this story, we've got to ask, who are these characters? Where are they? So we might want to look at a map. And so obviously we can see them, Russia, India, China, they're all there and that kind of thing. But when we talk about new powers, we're going to ask about old powers, these old masters. Are they going to, give up the seat and the throne very easily? What are they going to do? Where are they? This global north, Europe and America, the north. And so we've got north at the top of the map over there. And the global south is really active now. But this thing about north bothers me about telling the story. So this BRICS thing, if they're going to flip the table, are they going to reshuffle things? So should we put south at the top of the map now? Should we center the world map on south? And for this question, I want to ask, why is north at the top of the map? But before I give the answer, or before we come to the answer, we'll ask the question, how do we figure this one out? What's the way of knowing this? So we go on a bit of a journey. Let's go backwards. Let's not start in the last century. Let's go backwards really far, 1,000 years back, and see what was the world then. So what we see is actually the world is quite interconnected, globalized already by 1000 AD. If you had to guess who was the center of the world, the biggest city, Baghdad. Yeah. If we didn't know this, you can see the activity is clustered eastwards. Eastwards, there's activity in Africa. Europe is quite small. They're lagging behind. What we see here, let's focus in Southern Africa, Mapungubwe. It's quite a hub in Southern Africa. There's a network in Africa. There's the network in North Africa, precursor to the Islamic slave trade there. We look eastwards. I mean, look at this. This is a globalized world. It's centered around the Indian Ocean. This Atlantic moment is another myth about, oh, globalizing the world, information age, and that kind of thing. Moving across North Africa, we see, yes, Europe is there. You know, they're there. There's this whole other world that's happening. And Europe is really far behind. They only really kick it into gear once they industrialize and start foraging and pillaging the world. So, so 11th to the 13th century, we have the world quite interconnected. Let's go 15th century. Yeah, things are moving outwards. Pretty much from 1000 AD, the north of Africa, from Tunis to the Gobi Desert, they've been connected. And we've got some exploratory voyages. You know, these dabblers are going to this landmass on the other side. Who knows where east, west, north, south is? I mean, East India had to be East India because they found Americas and they call it West Indies, you know, that kind of thing. What's the logic in all of that? So you've got these garden cities, 100,000 people, huge civilizations there at the time. 15th century. Yes, we know late 18th century, this kind of Atlantic voyages and the world's pretty much interconnected maritime stuff. But now here we are, the 21st century, the top rapid growth cities. So these are the top 50 rapid growth cities and what they're doing with each other. I mean, it's pretty complicated. So when we do this, what story are we telling? Who are the players? It's a bit complex for me. And I'm like, I don't know how to make sense of it. So I'm like, I need to drop the land. I really need to work with borderless thinking to say what's really going on. This fixedness to land limits our way of thinking and telling a story because I need to know who the key players are, who the supporting characters are, and who the extras are going to be. And here I needed to simplify more. So what we did was we applied some complexity theory, some network algorithms to say, what is their relationship? They're interconnected. What we notice here is that they're color-coded by region. Each bubble represents a country with the amount of cities in them that are rapid growth cities. The thing to notice is the combination of colors and that there is no specific core, that the core is quite entangled with each other. This is what's happening now. So when one shifts out, at the center, what you'll find is the US and China, Japan, South Korea. Are they a core? You know, do they form a core together? So what this does is it actually contradicts the normal core periphery story. What we found in some years ago, when we started doing the same thing for these maps, taking away the land and looking at their network diagram, was we look at that regions are kind of color-coded and there's a regional focus. So if one region drops, they're not really bringing down the whole system. It's interconnected, but there's a certain kind of regional diversity. Again, 15th century, that's what the world looked like. I'm proposing that these are world maps. You know, why do we have to have north? This whole question of why is north at the top of the map falls away in this process of trying to answer why is north at the top of the map. So you have the 11th century, how it changed to the 15th century, and what we noticed now to the 21st century. It was at least a clear shift. The pattern has changed, the entanglement has changed. Now, so what has this told us? The question of how do we tell the story informs what story we're telling. It's not about what's the story I'm telling, then how do I tell the story? It's a two-way dialectical process. So if we need to ask, how are we telling a story? It does inform the story. It's a way of knowing. The how question is quite an important question. So let's unmask time a little bit. This cool little thing, also inspired by Hans Rosling's TED Talk about how to use data, move it across time. What you have there is bubbles representing cities. Now we're going to go from 900 AD to the current day, and we're going to see which cities, these are the top cities, the rise and fall of cities. So cities are coming and going. There's a similar pattern. That's what we see, 1500s, 1600s, and then something's happening. Okay, what happened? We don't really know. So, so we go, let's pause it. Okay, 1300s, it's the same. More colors means more regional diversity. That's fine, that's been the pattern. 1500s, that's fine. 1700s even, still, that didn't happen. Europe is kind of moving around the globe. But what we notice coming up soon is that let's track some cities. Istanbul, Baghdad, Kaifeng, East Asia has always been quite active. London, let's see when London finally comes onto the map. Delhi comes and goes, yeah, jumping in there, 1600s, and then the 1800s. It's really this industrialization phase. And things are back to a little bit more colorful, but let's look at London and when they shifted. And let's look at the European ascendance moment, European hegemony. We notice that the green colors are starting to become prominent. So when Europe ascended, it didn't leave a multicolored kind of network. It made it mostly green, so it kind of pooled in everything, marginalized the rest of the world, and built itself up. But that hegemonic phase is passing. So we've asked some questions about BRICS. How do we know BRICS? But these are the big stories. That's another myth. A story we don't talk about are the small stories, the stories that are from below. And for this we ask, okay, what about the bricklayer who is building a school outside my house today? Is he connected to the BRICS story? What does that mean for him? What about questions of gender justice when BRICS nations famously wage war on women? And who will the fathers of the new nations be? And this new world system? Is there any room for mothers? We've all heard stories of fathers of a nation, fathers of a nation. It seems that these old daddies were quite homosexual, actually. If they continue to father nations without any mothers. I find that an irritating kind of neglected, marginalized, illegitimated story. So we hear enough of the fathers of the nation. Where are the women's stories in BRICS stories? Where are women's voices in this? What does it mean for gender justice and the right to love who you love when these countries don't exactly agree politically, but it's just an economic bloc? And so I took one example, South Africa and India, and I asked the question of Sonal, the South African Indian that I know. And I wanted to ask about what is the South African Indian thing? I mean, it's a BRICS thing, but how do we work with it? So let's look at Sonal's life story, but let's ask again the question of how do we tell this story? How are we telling our story? Typically, when you tell these life stories, it's tell me the story of your life. I'm going to write a biography. It's going to be linear. It's going to have a start and an end. It's a novel. It ends at a full stop, But I find that quite arrogant. It's the arrogance of linearity, that a person's life and complexity can be locked and reduced into a finite statement and answer. So I said, let's destabilize. Let's look at a different way of telling the story again. And we came up with this to say, okay, let her life story be an open-ended piece of art that's in the middle of science and in the middle of art. In the space between art and science. To say that in her early childhood, she had this phase of seemingly constructed childhood innocence, and then she went to an interracial school. And so where she identified as Indian before, she was now colored. Colored girl said, but why aren't you sitting with us? You're colored. And she's like, but I'm Indian. And she apparently, she looks Indian, and she grew up in this group areaed place for Indian people. And so this thing kind of disrupted her, and then sometimes she's black, but then she's Indian and she's colored. And then now she's framed it as this, it's a rainbow story, it's this rainbow nation thing, it fits into that 4-nation thing about, hey, we're all colorful and all that kind of thing. But it seems that frame still has robbed her of her security of identity. That rupture hasn't really left. You see, it's a nagging thing. It's crept into her soul and ruptured that security. And why? Why do we have to deal with that bogus kind of concept in the first place? One question that we put on the table when we think BRICS is we've got to deal with the past. We've got to settle the arguments and finish the unfinished business. And an unflattening of this flattened Indian nationality, ethnicity, kind of a race will work, unflatten it. And so if Indian is an invented ethnicity thanks to the Population Registration Act and Group Areas Act, so too is white ethnicity and black ethnicity and colored ethnicity. These things are inventions that were locked in myths that masquerade as truth. They were pulled in from somewhere, invented. What they really are political social positions. To think that whiteness and blackness and Indianness can all be locked into some kind of reduced thing. A country like India with its diversity of castes, religions, languages, to be locked into an ethnicity here. The ridiculousness of it hasn't really tapped on our door enough. So when we want to ask certain questions, let's look at the metaphors. Metaphors bring things together that are seemingly disconnected. Metaphors help us see a masquerade. And I like the metaphor of a masquerade, that something is pretending to be something that it's not, really. I mean, you take a piece of truth and you mask it, and then you have a piece of fiction that masquerades. So, like maps that have countries and land masses that are actually metaphors for the real world, race, too, is a bad metaphor that's run itself loose and seems to own us instead of having us as persons who are categorized as these kinds of things. And I think that's problematic because the history owns the person and it continues to own the person. So what we've actually been doing is when we add the human question to those visual design questions is that we've entered into something called, I'm working with critical design thinking. It's not this typical plastic kind of full color thinking, 6 thinking hats design thinking. It's a kind of critical social literacy that governs all hats. It governs the kind of material that hats are made of. It's not something you put on. It's something that shifts your eye and your ability to see. Critical thinking allowed me to see when an ex-academic supervisor at UCT, and listen to this one, because we're students or we're learning. So when an ex-academic supervisor wanted to control my academic freedoms and wanted to take the data from my master's, control it for her own career building and profiteering gain at UCT, because it's sexy and savvy research. It's data that's unpublished, and she could build a good career on this. I saw that as wrong. And I didn't know it at the time, but I felt it first. And I dug and I found language for this. And I rebelled, and I had to rebel because I hate when outsiders come to Africa to farm Africa and mine Africa for its narratives. It's not your narrative. Bugger off. Or at least do business on our terms instead of this interventionist approach to come here and colonize. It's called neocolonialism, this kind of US imperialism, European imperialism that continues itself. So that's what I hate, and I don't say I hate things much. But this kind of critical design thinking also allowed me to see that universities then, what are they really? Are they really places of learning and education, or are they storage houses, long queues for the labor market, during which you wait in masses and further get beaten into the cog you're supposed to be for the machine, subservient, owned, dulled of all critical, creative, and curious thinking, and radical rebelliousness, which flowers during your adulthood, indoctrinated into what the neoliberal economy wants. Is that what education is these days? Where you are in a strip mine, in a warehouse, in a concentration camp where intellectual violence is underway. Can you see it? It's urgent. The icebergs are melting. Your imagination is being colonized. Can you see it? So this is the thing about critical design thinking. It's adding human questions to these visual ways of destabilizing these norms. Now, I'm going to end with the final answers. Stories allow us to interfere with the masquerade. Stories are a way of seeing and a way of knowing. The use of metaphors in stories allows us to interfere with the liminal space between truth and fiction. Art lives in that borderland between taken for truth and that we must see. Critical design is what good art does. It blurs this line between science and art, philosophy and materiality. And so the final answer is, what's this way of knowing? BRICS, masquerades, and other things. But my final answer is not a finite answer, and it's deliberately so. The final effect of my work is not an answer, but is more questions for you and the ability to question. So I'll leave you with the last piece, and we go back to story for this, because good art, good stories are metaphors, and they expand your thinking and connect you to unconnected parts in your own mind, from the wilderness of your soul to the scrapyards of your soul, and maybe there's some healing along the way. So the final writer is the reader. Can you see compassion when it is in front of you, issued to you, shown to you? Do you encounter it, or do you flee? Do you run away and leave ego behind, to shut it down, to reject it? Compassion too must be seen. It must be let in, instead of misery, instead of dead thinking. Drop the willful blindness and encounter it. The final writer is the reader, you and your ways of knowing. Thank you.